Welcome to your class on ovulation with natural fertility and power. I'm Dr. Emily Pocha, naturopathic doctor and owner of Wildcraft Medicine in La Jolla, California. Today is part one of a four-part series all about ovulation. We're going to be talking about what ovulation is and what are the different hormones that are needed in the body to make ovulation happen. So let's dive in. First, we need to understand what ovulation is. Ovulation happens mid-cycle when the ovaries release an egg for possible fertilization. So if it's fertilized, it goes to the uterus to implant, and if it doesn't get fertilized, then that's what triggers our periods. So let's talk a little bit about the different major hormones that are responsible for supporting ovulation, both just in general and on all about the different timing. So the four main hormones that we're going to talk about are FSH, which is follicular stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and those two hormones actually come from the pituitary in the brain, and they signal to the ovaries. And the last two you're probably more familiar with are estrogen and progesterone. And these are both made by different types of cells in the ovaries. Estrogen is made by granulosa cells, and progesterone is made from something called the corpus luteum. So let's talk a little bit about how these hormones talk to each other. So first we have a release from the pituitary of FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and it does exactly what its title says it does. It stimulates our ovaries to produce follicles. So our ovaries produce about 15 to 20 follicles each month, and on day 7 of our cycle, one of them is picked to be the dominant follicle. And that one continues to grow while the other ones shrink and don't move further than that. So we have one follicle now that's continuing to grow, it's continuing to swell in size. The other thing that FSH does is it stimulates the granulosa cells to release estrogen. Now estrogen is very important because it helps this follicle continue to grow. It also helps to support the lining of the uterus, called the endometrium, to thicken. And this is really key because if we get a fertilized egg, we need that egg to go to the uterus and be ready for implantation. And that thick lining is what we need for a healthy pregnancy. So estrogen is helping to allow the follicle to grow, but it's also getting the uterus ready just in case we have fertilization. Estrogen also helps to influence our cervical mucus. So the mucus that comes from the cervix, that will change depending upon where you are in your cycle, and that can tell us a lot about where we are in terms of menstruation and ovulation and so forth. So that's another important thing that estrogen does as well. So as this follicle, this one dominant follicle is growing and estrogen is being released and the lining of the endometrium is thickening, we get to a point somewhere in the middle of our cycle where estrogen hits its peak. This signals the follicle that's swelling to eventually burst. When it bursts, it releases a few different things, but most importantly, it releases the ovum. And this is what is released from the ovaries down into the fallopian tubes to eventually get fertilized, if it's going to be fertilized. It also leaves behind the corpus luteum, and we talked about the corpus luteum is what produces progesterone. So once that follicle bursts and the ovum is released, we get a surge in LH, luteinizing hormone. And this is a signal to our body to actually release the ovum from the ovaries into the fallopian tube. So estrogen helps the follicle burst, and LH surge helps that ovum that's now burst from the follicle to be released down the fallopian tube. And this is really what triggers ovulation. So the second part of our cycle, ovulation onward, is called the luteal phase for that reason. And in this phase, progesterone is really important. So once the follicle bursts, we've got the ovum now going down the fallopian tubes, and we've got left over the corpus luteum still in the ovaries, and that's what's producing progesterone. So progesterone's role is to continue to help support that lining of the endometrium, so it kind of takes over the role of estrogen in the second half of your cycle. And it also helps to, if we do get fertilization of that ovum, then progesterone will continue to be produced. That way there's no shedding of that uterine lining. So let's kind of go backwards a little bit. So now the ovum is going down the fallopian tube. There's no fertilization. progesterone stops being produced, and we have a shedding of that uterine lining. And that's where we get our period from. If the ovum is fertilized with sperm, it goes to the uterus and implants, and there's another hormone that's released called HCG, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. That's the pregnancy hormone, and that signals the body to continue to make progesterone. So progesterone is a really key hormone if we want to get pregnant. We want to make sure that the lining of the endometrium doesn't shed, because we need it there to support the ongoing pregnancy. If the ovum is not fertilized, then we can shed that lining, and you'll see a drop in progesterone will signal that shedding of the lining of the uterus. So that's a little bit about how all the hormones are playing a role, how they're talking to each other. You can see it's quite a delicate dance. We've got some coming from the brain, some coming from the ovaries. They're all triggering different things in our body. The other big thing that estrogen, progesterone, and some of these other hormones will trigger is change in our body temperature and change in our cervical mucus, as we mentioned before. So these are going to be really key things that we look at when we're trying to track ovulation and understand, did we actually ovulate and release an egg, or did we just have a period without ovulating? That can happen too. So in our next class, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some really great and easy ways that we can track looking at different things like basal body temperature and cervical mucus. So stay tuned, and we'll talk to you soon.